So, your memoir has a villain. Most of us can relate. Unfortunately, the villains in memoirs can range from a misguided friend or family member all the way to a malicious, terrible abuser. But they all have one thing in common, and that is they are the tension that makes your memoir interesting. Oh, yeah, they have one other thing in common. They might be mad that you're writing about them as a villain. If you have been stalling on your memoir progress because you are not sure how to write about these people without vilifying them so much that you lose relationships or worse, get sued, I have got some advice for you today. You are not going to want to miss this video. Stay tuned.
If you're writing a memoir, but you're not sure where to start, and let's face it, you're not really sure where you're going after you do get started, then you are not alone. Not having a plan for your memoir is one of the most common reasons I see that people fall off of these projects that they care about so deeply. And that's why my team created the Memoir Method Checklist. This absolutely free download is going to take you through every single step along with the timeline, all the way from your seed of an idea all the way through holding that beautiful book in your hands. And you can download it at pageandpodium.com/checklist. Happy writing.
So, the question of what to do with your memoir's villain is hands down one of the most common questions that I get. Now, typically, people are asking how they can write their true story, write their truth without getting sued. We have another video for that, although I am not a lawyer and it is not legal advice. But the way that our subscriber who wrote in, shout out to Hope, asked this question really jumped out to me because what she was asking was not necessarily about the legal ramifications, but more about the relational ramifications. Now, I have seen this before actually. I have a current coaching client who is writing about essentially escaping a cult, and the cult leader has long been passed away. But many of the people that continued to follow him and stay in the cult, his family members, are still living. And as she has told me, they're great people in a lot of ways. They just really got sucked into this guy's stuff. So how then do you write this book without feeling like you're just ostracizing yourself from your entire community, everybody that cares about you, but also cares about that person? So I think this is a really worthwhile issue to dive into in some depth. So I want to talk about kind of the problem that we're facing here because I think I can give you a different framework to think about it. I want to also then back up behind that and go to the cause. And then, of course, I'm going to give you some practical solutions, some things that you can do to move forward with this. Of course, no one can give you just one answer. You'll have to think about it yourself. But I am really hopeful that from my experience, I can give you some mindset shifts that are going to be really useful. So first, let's talk about what the problem is here. One of the things that I think makes memoir so rewarding, but also kind of difficult, is that a lot of times we are writing about having overcome something that was really difficult, often a little bit traumatic or a lot traumatic, and just something that really probably we shouldn't have had to go through, something that we really didn't deserve to go through. But at the end, we came through and we were better off for it. And of course, that's the big payoff, right? Is that we're better off at the end. But you can't get your reader to the end, to that triumphant finish line, if you can't tell the hardships that you've been through, right? And there just simply is no way to do that if you aren't going to bring the villain in. It would just be very non-specific, right? We could see you kind of, doing something really great at the end, but we're not going to get a sense of why that's so great if we don't have that whole entire journey of what you went through. And I want to give you an example from Jeanette McCurdy's excellent memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died. The title is shocking, I know. I was telling someone on a consult about that title and they kind of visibly recoiled. But if you read the book, you will understand why the title is the way that it is. Now, of course, it's tongue in cheek, and she is bringing in this really charming, funny voice to this book. So there's also, it's a little bit of it's a little bit of dark humor in the title as well. But the reason that I want to bring this book up is that it is a story of surviving a narcissistic parent. I hope that's not a spoiler. But as she is going through kind of her life, she really has to trace her very, very early memories of auditioning for things. So she was in iCarly. If you watched that show, she's been in some other things as well. But her mother really pushed her into acting when she was just 6 years old. All the way through her childhood, there are these really horrifying, really upsetting scenes. There are scenes, for example, where her mother is literally teaching her to have an eating disorder and encouraging her to have an eating disorder, but kind of gaslighting her into believing that, oh, it's for the best, I'm helping you out, whatever. We could not go all the way through that plot, see her on iCarly and etc., and then coming out and then, getting treatment for her eating disorder, if we didn't know that that came from her mother, that that was an intentional thing that her mother had done to her, we really would not be able to appreciate in the same way the things that she had to go through to overcome it. Because of course it wasn't, only all of the things that anyone who's ever had an eating disorder has to battle through. It also was the relationship with her mom, right? So that as she's trying to recover from her own illness, she also is really having to reconcile the fact that this came from her mother. And really, she had not even reconciled that she had been through abuse at that time. So we have got to really see that villain in really vivid details. We have to see what's going on in the scenes that happen, right? That is really hard because usually by the time we're writing the memoir, we do have clarity, right? We do realize that they were doing things to us that were really, really harmful, or that they were, giving us bad advice or whatever. Here is the problem with it, is what we want to do instinctively is we want to write out all of the things that they did, but we want to kind of color it, right? We want to really, I think this kind of comes from when we're traumatized. We really have this instinct to defend ourselves, right? I hate it, but it is a really common part of trauma, that as we come out of the trauma, we feel shame for our own trauma, right? We will blame ourselves for the things that happened to us. By the way, if you have trauma, it was not your fault and you did not deserve it. But that is just a thing that our brain does, right? It tells us that we should feel shame around it, that we really need to be very defensive. The problem is that when we are writing those scenes then, when Jeanette McCurdy was writing these scenes where her mother is teaching her to have an eating disorder, she knows at the point that she's writing that book all of the kind of technical terms around narcissism, personality disorders, and also just child abuse. And she recognizes what was happening. But at the time of the scene, she sure didn't, right? So I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that the telling of the villain's kind of backstory and our backstory with the villain is difficult, not only because kind of we're afraid and we don't want to alienate people, but also because our perspective is very, very different than it was at the time that the trauma was happening to us. And the problem here is not only that it makes it harder for us to write and harder for us to kind of think about how we want those scenes to flow onto the page, but also because our readers need to feel as though they are coming along for the story. No one wants to read a mystery where the whodunit is revealed in the first chapter. But that is often the instinct that I see in beginning memoir writers, is that they are looking at these scenes from either, childhood or maybe much more recent history, but history nonetheless. And they are wanting to kind of project all those defenses and all of those kind of things that you didn't learn yet onto those past experiences. The problem is that our readers really don't know us usually when they start reading the book. Now, if you're having friends and family read your book, of course, they will know you, probably, at least the people who are living now. We can't speak for, 100 years in the future, but the people do know you that are in your family. But we're hoping usually to reach a much broader audience, right? And remember that they don't know you. I mean, that actually is something Jeanette McCurdy had going, right? Is that a lot of people knew her from iCarly and really already felt connected. When you are just releasing a memoir and you are not a rich and famous celebrity, which I think, most folks watching this probably aren't, the problem is that you have to build that credibility. Now, Here is what I do not want you to hear me saying. Do not hear me saying that, you have to defend your trauma. You don't. But what you do need to do is make sure that you give your reader a chance to get to know you as you were then. You have all of this knowledge now, and we're going to get to that, right? We're going to see you learn and develop and grow over the course of the book. And what is more rewarding than that? That is the most amazing reading experience. But when you started out in your journey, you didn't know all that stuff. If you come in with all of that back knowledge, writing, say, as Jeanette did, as a 6-year-old, you are going to really struggle to catch that reader's credibility, right? Because what it's going to look like is, how would a 6-year-old know all of that, right? And then just naturally, this is a terrible thing, but just naturally people's brains go to, oh, I think that might be exaggerated, or like, oh, she's probably just making a bigger deal than it was, or, oh, that's just, for dramatic effect. I hate that that is how it goes, but it is how it goes. The other problem is arguably a much larger issue, and it is that if you are writing from this perspective of totally knowledgeable and projecting that onto your past self, you are probably going to be tempted to list every single thing that person did to you. Now, I have alluded to this in the past on this channel and other interviews that I've done, but that I am a survivor of narcissistic abuse. And one of the things that was so interesting as I was, healing from this was that when I would meet with my therapist at that point, I would really want to just, spend the whole time like unpacking every single new kind of clue or piece of evidence or, manipulation that I hadn't recognized as manipulation or, piece of harm or humiliation, whatever it was. And it would just end up, we spent, I don't remember well, but we spent at least a couple sessions where I was just saying terrible things that this person had done to me. Well, eventually my therapist kind of intervened and she was like, you know what? Really, like this, if this is helpful, we can keep doing this, but I want to share with you some information that you can read and kind of process on your own and bring into therapy, not about what he did to you, but about how you experienced what he did. That was such a light bulb moment for me because our instinct, again, our brain tells us, get in there, get all the stuff down, don't forget it, make sure that you're, demonstrating how terrible this situation was so people believe you. We have to just trust that the reader is going to believe us. And the way we do that is by speaking from our heart. So yes, we need the information about what happened. We need the scenes, just as I said about Jeanette McCurdy's book. We need the scene where her mother teaches her to have an eating disorder. We need that. But we also need to see what that did to Jeanette when she wasn't with her mother, right? We also need to see her later at a party having, an extreme eating disordered reaction to a craft services table behind the set at, a film she was shooting. We also need all of the information about you. And in fact, arguably, that is the point of the memoir, not what that person did to you. So the thing we've got to really move past then is this real tendency to kind of stack the evidence, to really feel like we need to be defensive and defend ourselves, and switch over to really trusting. This is really hard if you've been through trauma, but really trusting that the person you're communicating with, the reader, is going to follow you and go with you and be sympathetic. It's so hard. I know it is. But we've got to do it. It's absolutely what has to be done. So I want to talk now about some of the solutions, some of the practical things you can do in your writing to make sure that you are kind of following these principles of making sure that you're keeping it about yourself, you are keeping your future perspective, your current perspective out of some of those early scenes so that you can really make sure that as you're writing, not only are you writing a beautiful book, but you're also writing a book that is going to do what your reader needs it to do for them to get the help that they need and want out of your story. So here are a few practical solutions that I think are going to help you as you start to draft some of those villain scenes. The first one is, as you are writing all of those scenes, all of your reflections, really keep reminding yourself to keep the focus on you. I know that is really, really hard, But what we want to know is not what that person did to you, but rather how you survived it. So think about kind of who were you at the time. Give us a really vivid picture of where your mindset was and how well developed were you at kind of seeing what was happening. And if you weren't seeing it at all, then you don't want to project that onto your former self, right? We need to see who you were then when you were experiencing it. We want to see over the course of your memoir, we want to see the change and the growth and the development and the survival and the overcoming. And you can't do that if you start out with that perspective that you have now, but you didn't have then. So that's the first thing. Keep the focus on you. Yes, we need specific examples. And by the way, they should be specific scenes of things that happened in your life. But all of the framework really needs to be more about you expressing your experience than about pointing your finger at your abuser. I know I also want to point my finger at my abuser, but trust me, you are going to feel so much better about this book if you can focus on your own healing and your own growth. And the only way to do that is to frame it from your perspective in terms of how you experience these things. Okay, so besides keeping the focus on you, the second piece of advice I want to give you is a piece of advice that I give with some hesitation, and that is show, don't tell. Now, I have some pretty major issues with how this advice is bandied around in the writing community. Show, don't tell is good advice. The problem is, for memoir, we actually do need to tell things, right? There are a fair amount of things we need to share in memoir that really can't be shown. So what we need to do is think about the balance and when we are showing versus telling. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So when we're thinking about the balance of this, we want to make sure that when we are talking through what our villain did in our life, that is the point at which we need to be showing, not telling. What would this look like if we showed versus told? So let's use the Jeanette McCurdy example. In the scene where her mother is teaching her to have an eating disorder, we do not get Jeanette kind of popping in with a little aside saying, now this is horrendous and she shouldn't have done this and this was harmful for my whole entire life. We don't get that. That would effectively be a spoiler, right? All we get is the scene. She talks through where they were. She talks through, the different things that her mother said. She talks through the reason that this conversation came up. She just gives us the details the same way that you would in any, novel or fiction book, novel, the same way that you would in really any storytelling genre. We are just getting the pieces. She is showing us. If instead we kind of came in and instead of giving that scene, instead of showing, we said, my mother taught me to have an eating disorder way back when I was, just 11 or 12 years old, and that had a really harmful repercussions for my whole entire life. People are not going to be able to get the same impact if you're just telling us kind of what happened and what the result was. When we bring the villain in, and give and show people what they did in just a very clear way, a very clean way without a whole bunch of commentary, then we are able then to really pull the focus later when we reflect on that. We can pull that focus into us. We don't feel like we've got to be talking about what the other person was doing, whatever. We already showed that. Now we just get to talk about us. So I hope that's really clear then, how when we're just showing it, that really can help our reader, even if there's someone who knew that person. It can really help our reader kind of see what we saw, as opposed to us trying to persuade them of something. People really don't like to be persuaded. So if we can just show them, it's going to be a much more helpful way, a much more effective way, actually, of demonstrating the way that they played that role of villain in your book. Okay, my third piece of advice. This is advice that is often, you probably have heard this from, relationship experts and things, but it works just as well in memoir. And that is, we want to use I language. You've heard this before, yes? So if you are having a fight, with a family member or with your spouse or whoever it might be, the best advice, right, is to come in and say, I feel that, you were doing da 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 da, or I feel, really lonely, or I feel really abandoned, or I feel like there's too much pressure on me, whatever it might be. Our instinct very often in those heated emotional moments is to say, you didn't empty the dishwasher, or you said that mean thing and I told you I was sensitive about this thing, or whatever it might be. We want to say, you did it. The same kind of advice works really well in memoir. And memoir, after all, is an I genre, right? I would never suggest that somebody write their memoir in third person. We're going to usually write it in first person. And that's what you want to remember with your villain, too. Rather than, and it would probably be, he, she, them, but rather than kind of accusing and pointing the finger, we can say what we felt, what our experience was. Keep it in I language. Not because we care about maintaining the relationship with that villain, but rather because that's what we're trying to do in a memoir, right? That's the whole point, is to give the sense of how we felt, how we grew, what we thought. So keep your memoir in I language and be particularly cognizant of this around points where you have different things with your villain, because the tendency really is going to be to shift it and talk about what they did. We need to shift it back to us and talk about what we felt as the author. Okay, my fourth piece of advice, which really is an extension of all of the others I've said here, that is be specific. Remember I said earlier when I was talking with my therapist, when we were kind of working through all these issues that I'd experienced, I had such a tendency to come in with a laundry list. If I remember correctly, I even, had, because I journal a lot, I even had like a journal where I had kind of written all these things down. I was just reading it to her. That is what we tend to want to do, right? We need to avoid lumping together like with like here. And the other thing that we're going to want to do when we're writing, right, is say, oh, well, there were all of these instances in which he did X and Y and Z. Or, well, one of the things that they always did to me was A and B and C. That is very general, right? So we can say, oh, this person was very emotionally abusive, or, oh, this person, always left me at home alone, or this person, was having multiple affairs, or whatever it might be. We always want to think about kind of how do we project out the commonalities versus pulling what we might call an exemplar. An exemplar is just, if we look at this bucket of all these times these things happened, what's the one scene? What's the one example that if we pull that out of the bucket and have it stand alone is going to really communicate how common this was and how horrible it was, but with specificity. Remember what I said earlier about how the reader is going to tend to, if you kind of write your memoir in a particular way, the reader is going to want to tend to kind of question whether you're exaggerating, or kind of question I don't know if, that doesn't seem very credible or whatever, especially if it's an extreme trauma where people have not been through it themselves. You know that already from telling people, no doubt. So what we want to do is pull the specific example that proves the rule. How are you going to find one scene and then tell that scene, just like McCurdy did, tell that scene in a way that is going to feel very objective? It's not, but it's going to feel very objective. It's going to feel very fair, so that your reader can just look at what happened and draw their own conclusions, which no doubt they will fall on your side, right? You're the one that's telling the story. You're the one that's connecting with them. But the more we can really focus on specificity, the more that we can start to slowly unwind the way that we discovered kind of what was going on or learned about ourselves. So I want to go back to McCurdy's book, and I've alluded at this a bit, but as she went through, and when she's an adult, this is in the the Act 3, I would call the very last quarter of the book. She works with a couple different therapists. And one of the things this book does so beautifully, and this happens a lot in trauma memoir, it's a really excellent device to use if that's what you're working on. One of the things that she does is that she will talk through the conversations that she has with her therapist. What that does for the reader is it allows the reader to be in your shoes as the therapist is talking to you, so that your reader is getting the benefit of having all of these terrible traumas unpacked at the same time that you are. That is such a profoundly bonding experience for a reader when they are getting from your perspective not only what happened to you, but also the way that you discovered that. It's powerful. And the other piece of this is that it is also going to allow you to pull in all the correct terminology without, seeming like you're kind of projecting something that, if you're not a therapist, right, that is not really your specialty, but you do know it if you've been through this, right? You can use that same terminology and really bring your reader into a much more educated space about what it was that you went through without it feeling kind of unnatural or sort of wondering kind of how did you come up with this idea. We can put it into the voice of an expert, your therapist, a support group, a trusted friend. We can put it into their voice and their words, and it's another really great way to help show, not tell, what happened, which again is a way that you can make sure that the people that love that person can see that you are really just laying out the story and your experience of it. You are not pointing fingers particularly, although that's usually the effect, but you're not actively doing that. You just really want to communicate what was your experience and how you lived through it. Okay, I know this was a little bit heavier, a little bit darker episode, but I really hope that this was helpful. I know I have a lot of followers who are working on trauma-based memoir, and it is really, really hard, but it is so healing. Do not give up. Do not allow yourself to be swayed, by the what ifs. How will people react? Because I promise you, writing out this story is going to be so powerful for you. So, here's what I want you to do. Remember, this is your story, this is your experience. Keep your experiences in I language. Share your feelings rather than kind of pointing the finger. Make sure that you are bringing in a lot of specificity, and also stick in your truth. You know what happened to you, right? You know, no one else does. So I want you to move forward boldly and proudly. And if I can do anything to help support you in this profound journey, please, please reach out. I would love to hear your story, and I would love to help you with your book. Happy writing.
Writing your memoir can be one of the most rewarding, fulfilling, beneficial tasks that you can take on in this lifetime. But unfortunately, it can also be kind of a slog, especially if you don't know how to plan your time. And that is why my team has put together an absolutely free resource called the Memoir Method Checklist. This checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from that very first seed of an idea all the way through publishing that book and holding it in your hands. We're going to give you the steps, we're going to give you the timeline, and we are going to make sure that you always know where you're going, even a step before you get there. You can download this resource for free at pageandpodium.com/checklist. And once you do, let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you, hear about your book, and hear about how your writing is going.